My name is Margaret Foster, and the day I discovered my sister had taken the man I loved was the day my whole world turned upside down. People think betrayal comes from strangers, but when it comes from your own blood, it cuts deeper than any knife. My sister once stood beside me at family gatherings, smiling sweetly, telling me how lucky I was. "He's so handsome, so smart," she would say about Daniel, my boyfriend. Little did I know that praise was not admiration, it was desire. And one day, I found out my sister was smart enough to take him from me. My ex-boyfriend became her love, and I was left standing in the ruins of what I thought was my life. That is not where the story ends. But to understand how I came to that moment of heartbreak, you have to know where it all began. I was 54 then, living in a quiet Indiana town, the kind where everyone knows who you are and what you're doing. My days had a gentle rhythm: mornings at the library, where I worked part-time, afternoons in my rose garden, evenings sharing supper with neighbors or attending church socials. I had built a life of steady routines and small comforts, the sort of life people my age often cling to after decades of family obligations and personal sacrifice. Daniel entered my life at a moment when I had quietly given up on romance. He wasn't the flashiest man, no shiny sports car, no grand speeches, but he had a presence about him that made me feel safe. He was dependable kind with a sense of humor that surfaced at just the right time. He'd show up with a bag of groceries when I'd had a long day at work, or bring over a book he thought I'd like. I never asked him to do these things, but he did them because he cared. That meant more to me than flowers or jewelry. My sister Linda, on the other hand, had always been the star of the family. 2 years younger than me, she was the one people called the smart one or the talented one. Growing up, she got the higher grades, the better roles in school plays, and eventually the career that made everyone proud. She was a manager at a large insurance company in Indianapolis, always sharp in her suits, quick with her words. I loved her. Of course, she was my sister, but I never quite shook the feeling that our parents admired her a little more, expected a little more, and forgave her a little faster than they did me. Still, as adults, we had carved our own lives. She would visit me on weekends sometimes, staying overnight, and for a while it felt like old times, just us girls chatting in the kitchen. When I introduced her to Daniel, she smiled, wide, shook his hand firmly, and said, "Well, Margaret, you really found yourself a good one. Handsome and smart, don't let this one go." I remember laughing, then not thinking much of it. Compliments from Linda always carried a touch of competitiveness, but I figured it was just her way. Over the weeks that followed, I noticed how often Linda praised Daniel. She would lean over during dinner, laughing too loudly at his jokes. She would volunteer to help him with errands, like picking up supplies for his woodworking projects or driving him to the mechanic when his truck broke down. At first, I brushed it off as Linda being helpful. Daniel, after all, was charming in a quiet way that drew people in. But sometimes, I caught a look in Linda's eyes, a gleam I couldn't quite place that left me uneasy. One Sunday afternoon, we had a family picnic at the park. The grill was smoking. Kids were chasing frisbees across the grass, and I was balancing potato salad on my paper plate when I saw Linda and Daniel by the cooler. She touched his arm as she laughed, her head tilted just a little too close. I felt a flash of jealousy then, but I scolded myself. "Don't be silly, Margaret," I thought. "She's your sister, he's your boyfriend. You're just tired." But that unease lingered. It clung to me as I worked in the library, stacking books in silence. It whispered to me when I knelt in my rose garden hands in the dirt. It followed me into the quiet hours of the night when the house felt too empty and my thoughts too loud. Friends noticed too. One of my church friends, Betty, pulled me aside one Wednesday evening after Bible study. "Margaret, she said gently. I don't want to meddle, but your sister… Well, she seems awfully fond of Daniel, more than a sister should be. I laughed, nervously, brushed it off, and told Betty she must be mistaken. But inside, her words stirred something raw. I wanted to trust Linda. I wanted to trust Daniel. And most of all, I wanted to believe that at this stage of my life, after so many years of giving serving and waiting, I finally had something that couldn't be taken from me. Looking back, I realized that denial is often the first shield we build against betrayal. I ignored the signs because admitting them would mean admitting my sister could wound me in ways no stranger ever could. But the foundation was already cracking, even if I refused to see it. The whispers that began in my head after Betty's warning refused to quiet down. I tried to focus on my routines, telling myself that work, the library, and my garden would give me peace. But no matter how many books I shelved or roses I pruned, the unease clung to me like a shadow. Linda's visits grew more frequent. She always had a reason she needed a break from the city she wanted to see me. She thought Daniel could help with some small task. On the surface, nothing was inappropriate. Yet there was something about the way she smiled at him, the way her laugh lingered a beat too long, the way Daniel seemed just a little too eager to answer her calls. I told myself not to be paranoid. After all, what would people think if I accused my own sister of trying to take my man? They'd call me jealous, insecure, maybe even bitter. I could hear Linda's voice in my head, teasing me like she did when we were girls. Oh, Margaret, always so sensitive. That old sting from childhood still lived in me, and I hated that it gave her power. One Saturday, Linda arrived while I was cooking dinner. Daniel was already in the kitchen helping me chop onions. Linda walked in like she owned the place, kissed me on the cheek, then turned to Daniel with that same dazzling smile. "Oh, Daniel, look at you," she said. "You even help in the kitchen, Margaret. You hit the jackpot." She winked at me, but her eyes stayed on him. After dinner, when we were clearing the table, Linda leaned close and whispered, "You'd better hold on to him. Handsome and smart men like that don't stay free for long." I laughed uneasily, brushing her off, but the words nestled deep in my chest. A week later, I invited a few neighbors for coffee after Sunday service. We sat around the kitchen table, steaming mugs in our hands, sharing small-town gossip. One of them, a sharp-eyed woman named Joyce, casually asked, "So, Margaret, does your sister always spend this much time with Daniel?" My stomach clenched. "What do you mean?" I asked, forcing a smile. Joyce shrugged. "Oh, nothing. Just seems like she's here every time I pass by." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Every laugh, every touch, every compliment replayed in my head like a film I couldn't pause. Was I imagining things? Or was I refusing to see the truth right in front of me? I remembered an afternoon at the farmer's market. Daniel and I were picking apples when Linda appeared out of nowhere. She walked straight to him, brushing my presence aside as if I were invisible. "Daniel, you should try these Honey Crisps," she said, pressing one into his hand. He smiled politely, thanked her, and bit into it. She laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world. I stood there, holding my basket, my chest tight, wondering when I had become a bystander in my own relationship. Friends whispered. Neighbors noticed, even strangers seemed to sense something. But I held on to denial. I told myself that Linda was just being friendly, that Daniel was just being polite, that my own fears were playing tricks on me. Yet a part of me, the part that had endured years of living in my sister's shadow, knew better. I remembered growing up in that small Indiana house where Linda was always the star. She got the solos in choir, the lead roles in plays, the highest marks in school. At family dinners, our parents would beam at her stories, while mine were politely nodded at and quickly forgotten. I told myself I didn't mind. I told myself I was happy just being steady, dependable Margaret. But deep down, I had always felt less. And now, as I watched my sister laugh with Daniel, I feared history was repeating itself. Once again, Linda had found a way to take what was mine, to stand taller while I stood in the background. Still, I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I buried myself in routines, clinging to the belief that if I worked hard enough, trusted deeply enough, I could keep my world from falling apart. But the cracks were already widening. The more I tried to hold everything together, the more the truth pushed against the walls I had built. I didn't know it then, but the storm was already on its way. The storm broke not with thunder, but with a whisper. One ordinary Tuesday afternoon, I was putting away books at the library when a neighbor, Ruth Simmons, stopped by my desk. She leaned in, her voice low, her eyes scanning the room as if afraid of being overheard. "Margaret," she said, "I saw Daniel at Miller's Diner last night." I smiled faintly. "Well, Daniel likes their meatloaf. It doesn't surprise me." She shook her head. "He wasn't alone. Your sister was with him. They looked comfortable." The word comfortable echoed in my mind like a bell tolling. I forced a polite smile, thanked her, and pretended to return to my work, but inside, I was unraveling. My hands shook as I tried to shelve a stack of novels, the letters on the spines blurring together. On my way home, I drove past Linda's house. Parked in her driveway right beside the hydrangea bush she loved to brag about was Daniel's old blue pickup truck. My heart thudded so loudly I thought it might shake the steering wheel. I sat there for a long moment staring at that truck. Every logical thought, every excuse I had made collapsed in a heap. It was no longer whispers, no longer suspicions, no longer my imagination tormenting me. It was real. The man I loved was inside my sister's home, and not as a guest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the floral wallpaper I had chosen years ago, a reminder of simpler times. Memories of Linda's laughter, of Daniel's smile twisted in my mind until they no longer brought comfort, but pain. I thought of Linda leaning across the dinner table, whispering, "You'd better hold on to him." Now I understood she hadn't been warning me, she'd been daring me. The next Sunday at church, I watched them from a distance. Daniel sat with Linda, their shoulders brushing their heads, leaning in close. My chest ached as I noticed how the congregation glanced at them, how whispers passed between pews. My humiliation wasn't private, it was public. I wanted to run, but my legs felt nailed to the floor. After the service, I walked out into the bright Indiana sun, and that's when Betty caught up with me. "Margaret," she said softly, "I'm so sorry." Her eyes were kind but full of pity, and I hated it. Pity felt heavier than anger. The family division came quickly. My brother Charles called one evening, his voice awkward over the phone. "Now, Margaret," he said, "I don't want to take sides, but you know Linda has always been the smarter one. Maybe Daniel just saw that." I nearly dropped the receiver. "The smarter one," I whispered. His words sliced me open. It wasn't enough that my sister had taken my boyfriend, my own family was ready to justify it, to make me the fool in my own story. After that, I stopped answering calls. I didn't want to hear the excuses, the platitudes, the veiled suggestions that maybe I should have seen it coming. I didn't want to be told that Linda was simply stronger, cleverer, more deserving. I wanted someone to say I had been wronged, but no one did. I remember the day Daniel finally came to my house. He didn't knock. He walked in like he always had, his boots leaving dust on the rug I had vacuumed just that morning. He looked nervous, but not guilty. That was the worst part. Margaret, he began shifting his weight. I think you already know. I stared at him, my throat dry. You and Linda, I managed to whisper. He nodded. I didn't mean for it to happen, but she understands me in ways I didn't expect. The room spun. I thought of every meal I'd cooked for him, every conversation we'd shared, every plan we'd made for the future. And now he was telling me my sister, my own flesh and blood, understood him better than I did. He left without looking back. The door closed and I stood in my silent house, the air heavy with betrayal. The days that followed blurred together. Whispers followed me in the grocery store. I saw neighbors glance at me, then quickly look away. At the library, patrons who once lingered to chat now kept their conversations brief, their smiles thin. I became a woman marked by scandal, my pain displayed for the whole town to see. I would sit in my rose garden dirt, caked under my fingernails, tears soaking the petals. Roses had always been my pride symbols of beauty and resilience. But now even they seemed to mock me, blooming bright and bold, while I withered inside. Linda called once, her tone brisk as though she were discussing the weather. I know this is hard for you, Margaret, but Daniel makes me happy. You'll understand one day. Understand? How could I understand watching my sister take what was mine and parade it through town as if she had earned it? That was the day I stopped answering her calls. That was the day I realized betrayal wasn't a storm that came and went. It was an earthquake, splitting open the ground beneath me, leaving me to balance on crumbling edges. The weeks after Daniel left me for Linda bled together like gray watercolor running down a page. The calendar on the kitchen wall still hung on May, though June had already come. I couldn't bring myself to flip it. Every day felt the same silent heavy, like I was walking through molasses. The house became unbearably quiet. Where there had once been the sound of Daniel's boots on the floor, his humming while fixing a chair, or his voice calling my name, there was now only the tick of the clock and the creak of old wood. I would catch myself, reaching for 2 plates when setting the table, then push one back into the cupboard with a trembling hand. I stopped going to church for a while. It wasn't that I had lost faith in God, but I couldn't bear the stares, the pity in some eyes, the judgment in others. I knew what people were saying. In a small Indiana town, secrets don't stay secret, and betrayal becomes a form of entertainment. Margaret's sister stole her man, they whispered at the grocery store, at the diner, even in the pews where I once prayed for strength. Sleep slipped away from me. I'd lie in bed staring at the shadows on the ceiling, my mind replaying every moment with Linda and Daniel, the smiles, the touches, the dinners, where I laughed along while they made fools of me. I would get up, wrap myself in a sweater, and wander to the garden in the moonlight. My roses still bloomed proudly, their petals wide and unashamed, but I felt like a wilted stem among them. Food lost its taste. I dropped weight without trying. Betty from church stopped by with casseroles, but most of them went untouched. I didn't tell her that it hurt to eat alone, that every bite felt like gravel in my throat. One morning, I drove past Linda's house by accident. At least that's what I told myself. Daniel's truck was parked out front, just like it had been the day I first realized the truth. But this time, Linda stepped out onto the porch, her hair shiny, her laugh ringing through the air as Daniel followed behind her. They looked like a couple out of a picture book, while I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The humiliation was suffocating. It wasn't just that I had been betrayed, it was that my betrayal was public property. People I'd known for years, people I'd cooked for, prayed with, and helped through their own troubles, now looked at me as if I were pitiful. One evening I broke down completely. I sat on the kitchen floor back against the cabinets and sobbed until my chest ached. I wasn't just grieving the loss of Daniel. I was grieving the loss of trust in my sister, the loss of dignity in my community, the loss of the life I thought I had built. I whispered into the darkness. Why wasn't I enough? That question haunted me. I replayed my whole relationship with Daniel, searching for signs I had missed, flaws I should have fixed, ways I should have been smarter, prettier, livelier. The cruelest part of betrayal is how it makes you doubt yourself, even when you're the one who was wronged. Days turned into weeks. Bills piled up on the counter. I went through the motions at the library, but my co-workers noticed how pale I'd grown, how my smile never reached my eyes. I was living, but not alive. Linda called once, not to apologize, but to gloat in her own twisted way. "Daniel and I are planning a trip," she said breezily, as if she were telling me about the weather. "It feels so good to be with someone who understands me." Her words lit a fire of rage inside me, but it was smothered quickly by despair. I hung up without answering, my hands trembling. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her she hadn't just taken a man, she had taken my peace, my security, my place in the family. But the words stuck in my throat. The lowest point came one Friday night. I had been sitting in my recliner for hours, the television flickering on mute, a half-empty glass of wine in my hand. I realized I hadn't spoken to another human being all day. The loneliness pressed in on me until I could barely breathe. I thought of driving away, just leaving everything behind, but where would I go? This town was my whole life, and yet it had become a cage of shame. Still, somewhere deep inside, a small spark refused to die. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was faith, maybe it was the echo of my mother's voice, telling me I was stronger than I knew. But even in the darkest nights, I found myself whispering, "This can't be the end of me." At the time, I didn't know what form survival would take. I only knew that if I let Linda and Daniel's betrayal destroy me, then they would win twice. They had already taken my heart. I would not let them take my soul. The turning point came quietly, not with fanfare or lightning bolts, but with a single morning when I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. My skin was pale, my eyes hollow. My shoulders slumped forward, as though I were carrying the weight of the whole world. I stood there clutching the edge of the sink and thought, if I don't change something, I'm going to disappear. That same day, Betty stopped by again with another casserole. But this time, she didn't just leave it on the counter with a sympathetic smile. She sat me down at the table and looked me straight in the eye. "Margaret," she said firmly, "I've known you for years. You are not this broken woman sitting in front of me. You're strong, and you've got too much life left to waste it grieving over them." I wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't understand. But the truth was, she did. Betty had been widowed young, raising 3 kids on her own. She had walked through grief and fire and come out the other side. Her words carried the weight of someone who had lived it. That night I prayed for the first time in weeks. Not the desperate, tearful prayers I had whispered before, but a steady, quiet plea, "God, help me find myself again." The next morning, I made a decision. I would stop waiting for my sister's apology, or for Daniel to admit his mistake, or for the town to change its whispers. None of that was in my control. What I could control was how I chose to live the rest of my days. It began small. I cleaned the house, scrubbing away weeks of dust and neglect. I opened the windows and let the summer breeze sweep through the rooms. I baked a pie and took it to a neighbor just to feel useful again. Little acts, but each one felt like a step back toward myself. One day, while tending my roses, I thought, if I can bring these flowers to life, why not something bigger? That seed of an idea grew. I had always dreamed of opening a small flower shop, something cozy, filled with roses, daisies, lilacs, and all the blooms that made people smile. I had pushed it aside for years, telling myself it was too late, too impractical. But now, with nothing left to lose, I asked, why not now? I took the leap. With a small loan from the credit union and some savings, I rented a tiny storefront downtown. It was nothing glamorous peeling paint, squeaky floors, but it had big windows that let in the sunlight. I painted the walls, filled the shelves with vases, and brought in buckets of flowers from local growers. The first time a customer walked in and smiled at the scent of fresh roses, I felt something in me heal. With every bouquet I wrapped, with every kind word exchanged over the counter, I stitched myself back together. The shop became more than a business. It was a place for people to gather to share their joys and sorrows. Widows came in to buy flowers for their late husbands' graves. Young men nervously picked out roses for first dates. Children pressed their noses to the glass, marveling at the colors. And I stood at the center of it all, no longer invisible, no longer broken. As the months passed, I grew stronger. My laughter returned, softer at first, then fuller. I found joy in simple things again, the feel of sun on my face, the sound of birds in the morning, the satisfaction of a well-tended garden. I even started speaking at women's gatherings, sharing my story not as gossip, but as testimony. I told them about betrayal, about the pain that nearly destroyed me, and about the choice to rise anyway. To my surprise, women leaned in, nodding, some with tears in their eyes. They had their own stories, different details, same heartbreak. My words gave them hope. For the first time in a long while, I felt proud of who I was. Not because of Daniel, not because of Linda, but because of the strength I had found within myself. I still saw them around town, of course. At first it stung. They would walk past my shop, Daniel carrying her groceries, Linda smiling with that smug tilt of her chin. But as the years went on, I noticed the cracks. Their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. Their laughter sounded forced. And when they passed my shop, Linda's gaze lingered just a little too long on the bouquets in the window, as if she could sense the happiness she hadn't been able to steal from me. It was then I realized my revenge wasn't in seeing them suffer. My revenge was in refusing to let them define me. My revenge was in thriving. And thrive I did. It's funny how time reveals what people are truly made of. By the time 2 years had passed, the shop had become a cornerstone of my life, and to my surprise, a quiet success. Folks came not only for flowers, but for conversation advice, or just to sit among the blooms and breathe in a bit of peace. I had found my place again. Linda and Daniel, however, were not faring so well. Word trickled through town like it always does about the arguments, the money troubles, the way Linda's sharp tongue cut at Daniel in public places. At first, I brushed it off as small-town gossip. But then I saw it with my own eyes. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I stopped by the post office. Linda and Daniel were ahead of me in line. She was scolding him, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You can't even remember to bring the checkbook. What good are you?" she snapped. Daniel's face turned red, and he lowered his gaze like a scolded child. People shuffled awkwardly, pretending not to listen, but I saw the sideways glances. I didn't smile, though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a part of me that felt vindicated. They had humiliated me once, now their humiliation was out there for everyone to see. By the 4th year of running my shop, I had grown into a woman I hardly recognized, confident, busy, even joyful. On Saturday mornings, I hosted flower arranging workshops. On Sundays after church, I stayed open for an hour so folks could pick up bouquets for family dinners. I was not just surviving, I was respected, even admired. And then one rainy afternoon, Linda walked into my shop. I almost didn't recognize her. Her hair, once glossy and styled, was dull and limp. There were dark circles under her eyes. She wore a coat that looked a little too thin for the season, and her hands trembled as she set her purse on the counter. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the rain tapping against the windows and the faint hum of the cooler where the lilies rested. Finally, she said, "Hello, Margaret." Her voice was softer than I remembered, stripped of the confidence that had once filled every room she entered. "Hello, Linda," I replied evenly, my hands steady as I wrapped a bouquet for another customer. When the shop cleared out, she lingered. "I needed to see you," she admitted. "Things with Daniel, they haven't been easy." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "Turns out, he isn't as dependable as I thought. He can't keep a job, and well, you probably don't care." I didn't answer. I simply looked at her, waiting. Her eyes filled with tears. "I thought having him would make me happy. I don't know what I thought. But I'm not happy, Margaret. And I know I hurt you. I know I betrayed you in the worst way." There it was, the admission I had once longed for, the words I had cried for in the silence of my kitchen years ago. But hearing them now, I felt no surge of triumph. Only a quiet, steady calm. "Linda," I said finally, "you didn't just take Daniel. You took my trust, my peace. You let me stand alone in front of our family and neighbors, humiliated. That's not something an apology can erase." She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I know. I needed to say it." For a long time, I stood there watching my sister, the same sister who had once mocked me for being too sensitive, too soft, too trusting. She looked small now, broken in ways I couldn't fix. I realized then that revenge doesn't always look like fire and fury. Sometimes it looks like standing tall, while the ones who wronged you crumble under the weight of their own choices. I didn't embrace her. I didn't invite her to dinner. But I also didn't turn her away. I sold her a simple bouquet daisies because they seemed fitting, and handed it to her without another word. When she left, I felt no bitterness, no burning rage, only freedom. Because the truth was, Linda had already lost far more than I ever could have taken from her. The day Linda came into my shop and admitted her mistake stayed with me for weeks. I turned it over in my mind like a stone in my pocket, rough at first, but smoother each time I touched it. I thought I'd feel victorious. I thought I'd walk around lighter, smiling at the justice life had finally served me. But instead, what I felt was something quieter, something closer to release. For so long I had carried the weight of betrayal on my back. It bent me low, stole my laughter, and tried to convince me I was nothing without their approval. But standing in my shop, strong and steady while Linda broke down, I realized I wasn't carrying that burden anymore. She was. One Sunday after church, Betty stopped by. She looked at me with a knowing smile as she picked out a vase of tulips. "I heard your sister's been struggling," she said gently. "How do you feel about that?" I paused, tying the ribbon around the stems. "Honestly, I feel sad. Sad for her, but not for me." Betty nodded. "That's Grace Margaret. Don't lose that." Her words stayed with me. Grace. It wasn't a word I would have chosen for myself years ago when I was curled up in the dark, wondering why I wasn't enough. But maybe grace was exactly what I had found grace for myself. Grace even for the sister who had hurt me. Not long after Linda called me, Her voice trembled as she said, "Daniel and we're done. He's moving out. I don't know what to do." There was a time when I would have savored that news, when I would have replayed it like a sweet melody. But instead, I simply listened. She talked about how lonely she felt, how empty her house seemed without the man she thought would save her. She admitted she had gambled everything, her reputation, her family ties, her relationship with me, for something that turned out to be hollow. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said. I don't have anyone else to tell." I didn't say I forgave her. That word still felt too big, too final. But I did say, "Linda, I don't hate you. I don't want to carry that weight anymore." It was the truth. I wasn't ready to open my arms, but I was ready to lay down the anger. That was enough. Life went on. The shop thrived. I found joy and community in the laughter of customers, in the quiet beauty of fresh flowers opening their petals each morning. I didn't remarry, but I didn't feel alone either. I had friends' purpose, and most importantly, I had myself. One summer afternoon, I stood at the counter arranging roses when a young woman came in. She was no older than 25, tears streaking her face. "My sister stole my fiancé," she blurted out before she even said hello. She looked at me desperately, as though I might hand her the answer along with a bouquet. I took her hands in mine. "Sit down," I said softly. "Let me tell you a story." And I did. I told her about Daniel, about Linda, about the long nights of heartbreak. But I also told her about the flower shop, about choosing myself, about the life I had built out of ashes. I watched her shoulders loosen, her breath steady, as she realized she wasn't alone. That moment changed me. I understood then that my story wasn't just about betrayal. It was about resilience, about hope, about showing others that even after life tears you down, you can stand again. As for Linda, we never returned to the closeness we once had. But sometimes she stops by the shop and we share polite words. It's not sisterhood the way I once dreamed of, but it's something in understanding that while the past can't be undone, the future doesn't have to be poisoned by it. Looking back, I see now that revenge isn't always about making others pay. Sometimes it's about reclaiming yourself, about refusing to let betrayal define your story. Linda thought she had won when she took Daniel. But the real victory was mine. I rose, I healed, and I built a life she couldn't touch. To those of you listening, maybe you've felt the sting of betrayal. Maybe someone you trusted, family, friend, or lover, cut you deeper than you thought you could bear. Hear me when I say this, that pain does not have to be your ending. You can choose yourself. You can build something new. And one day you may even look back and thank God that what you lost made room for what you gained. So take my story with you. Share it if you know someone who needs to hear it. And if you find comfort in my words, I invite you to stay with me to hear more stories of women who found strength when life tried to break them. Because we are never too old to rise. We are never too old to begin again.